Okay, so today I want to talk about the urinary system. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to find the urinary system. So to do that, we're going to start in the abdominal cavity, and let's just remove some organs. What is this that I'm removing here? Liver, good. Get rid of the stomach, all the intestines and all this type of stuff. And behind all of this digestive viscera, we find the urinary system. And in particular, here we have the kidneys, the paired kidneys. And it's important to keep in mind that all of these digestive organs are lined with membranes. They're lined by what we call the peritoneal membranes. So you have a visceral peritoneum that lines all of these digestive organs, and then you have what's called a parietal peritoneum that lines the abdominal cavity. And the reason I bring this up is because the kidneys are posterior to those membranes. The kidneys are located in what we call a retroperitoneal position, behind the peritoneal membranes. Okay, so that's what that means. So here we have the paired kidneys, and this is where most of the physiology that we're going to talk about at least occurs. And let's maybe just give a little overview. Here we have the thoracic aorta that passes through the diaphragm, and it becomes the abdominal aorta. And then we have two major branches off of the abdominal aorta that are going to send blood to the kidneys. And what are the specific names of these arteries that branch off the abdominal aorta that feed the kidneys? Those are the renal arteries. Good, those are the renal arteries. And essentially what's going to happen is the kidneys are going to remove a significant amount of fluid from the blood. They're going to, I guess the common word is they're going to say that, the kidneys filter blood. But essentially what they're doing is they're pulling solution and other materials from the blood, and they're making a new material, a new solution called filtrate. Now, most of that filtrate is going to be returned from the kidneys back into the blood. But anything that's not returned, which is just about 1% of the filtrate, is going to become urine. And it's the job of the remainder of the urinary system to get rid of that urine. And to do that, it passes out the kidneys through what we call the renal pelvis, and then into these long, slender tubes. What do we call these long, slender tubes? Those are the ureters. And the ureters deposit their material into this muscular collapsible sac down in the pelvic cavity. What do we call that? The urinary bladder. And then urine leaves the body from the urinary bladder through another tube called a urethra. And in males, the urethra is relatively long, and females have a short urethra. Good. What are these glands on top of the kidneys called? What are those glands? Those are the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands, and we talked about those in the endocrine system. And the outer layer, the adrenal cortex, is going to be responsible for producing steroid hormones. And one of those hormones is going to be important in kidney physiology, renal physiology. And can you guys tell me what steroid hormone released by the adrenal gland is going to act on the kidneys? Aldosterone. Good. Aldosterone is part of a larger physiological mechanism in the body called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. Okay, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. And it involves multiple organs in the body. But what is the stimulus for the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, I guess? ROS is the abbreviation for it. What's the stimulus for this renin-angiotensin system?
Stem from the pituitary gland?
What's the physical stimulus? What's happening in the body that's going to stimulate this axis to occur? It's going to be low blood pressure. Okay, so this is stimulated during periods of low blood pressure. So during a period of low blood pressure, that's actually detected by the kidneys. And in response to low blood pressure, the kidneys release an enzyme into the blood called renin. So now we have this molecule, this enzyme renin in the blood. And what renin is going to do is it's going to convert another molecule in the blood called angiotensinogen, that's produced by the liver. It's going to convert that into a molecule called angiotensin 1. Now we have angiotensin 1 circulating around in the blood, and eventually it's going to make its way up into the lungs. And at the pulmonary capillary level of the lungs, it gets exposed to an enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE. And what ACE does is it converts angiotensin. Did I get that? Does it convert it to angiotensin 2 or angiotensin 1?
We said 1 the first time.
We did say 1 the first time. Let me double check something. All right, so we were correct. Renin converts angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 circulates through the blood, it goes up into the lungs, and it gets converted to angiotensin 2 by ACE, by angiotensin converting enzyme. Okay. And angiotensin 2 is the molecule or the hormone, I guess, that's going to be responsible for elevating blood pressure. And it does that in 3 different ways. One of the ways it does that is it acts back up on the brain, and it acts on the hypothalamus region of the brain. Anybody know what angiotensin 2 does when it acts on the hypothalamus? It stimulates the thirst center. So it gives you a feeling of thirst. So you seek out water. Yeah. Yep, so the water gets into your blood and increases blood pressure. Another thing that angiotensin 2 does is it causes widespread vasoconstriction throughout the body. So if you don't have enough blood in the circulatory system, a way to increase blood pressure is to decrease the space that that blood is in. So it's widespread vasoconstriction. But the last thing that does is it acts on the kidneys. And what it does to the kidneys is it causes the kidneys to take sodium that normally would be released in the urine, and it causes that sodium to be reabsorbed back into the blood. So the question now is, well, why does sodium reabsorption, why does increasing the amount of sodium in the blood, how does that elevate blood pressure? Does anybody know the answer to that?
Water
Yeah, I was gonna say
Water
water.
follows.
Wherever sodium goes, water follows it. Okay, so it's an indirect mechanism to increase blood pressure. By increasing sodium reabsorption, water follows it from the urine, it goes back into the blood, and that increases blood pressure. So now we're looking at a pretty detailed model of the kidney. And specifically, this is a frontal section. It's been cut in a frontal section, and this is what we're looking at right here. Okay. All right, so we mentioned that the abdominal aorta comes down, and then the major artery off of the abdominal aorta that's going to feed the kidney is this one right there. And what did we say that was? That's the renal artery. So if this is the renal artery, what's this vessel below it? That's the renal vein. And both of these vessels, along with this structure right here, which we'll get to, they all enter and exit the kidney at one location. Okay, if you're going to have vessels going into an organ, you might as well have them go in one location. And so there's just one opening. And there's a name for this opening or this slit in the kidneys where all these vessels go into and out of the kidneys. And what do we call that? The hilum. Just like in the lungs. There's the hilum in the lungs too, that all the vessels enter and exit. So we have the renal artery that comes in here, and it branches and branches and branches. And we'll get into that. We'll get into that blood system a little bit further. But just for now, we can divide the kidney itself kind of into two different areas. The first area is this outer layer. What do we call this outer layer of the kidney? That's the renal cortex. Cortex just means outer layer. It's like the bark of the kidney. You see that term other places in the body. The adrenal cortex, the cerebral cortex. Okay, it just means outer layer. And then we have this middle layer right here called the adrenal medulla. Okay, and the adrenal medulla is made up of these structures that we call medullary pyramids or renal pyramids. And then there's these columns that separate that you can't see super well on this, but those are called the renal columns. Okay. What are the structures that we're going to find up here in the kidney that are responsible for filtering the blood, for actually performing a lot of this blood chemistry maintenance that the kidney does? So let me put it this way. The job of the kidney is to maintain blood chemistry. And it's gonna maintain water balance of the blood, electrolyte balance, and pH balance of the blood. And all of that occurs pretty much up here in the renal cortex. And there are structures in the renal cortex that are going to perform that function. In fact, there's 1 million of these structures all along the renal cortex. What are those individual structures called? Nephrons. Good, those are nephrons. All right, so let's get up to the nephrons here. We have the renal artery that comes into the kidney. It branches and branches and branches. And you can see here we have this artery that's separating the cortex from the medulla. But then you have these branches that run up, that radiate up the cortex. And we call those the cortical radiate arteries. Cortical because they're in the cortex, radiate because they're radiating up through the cortex. And there are little branches off of those called afferent arterioles, and the afferent arterioles feed into these capillary beds. Okay, we have millions of these capillary beds up here in the kidney, in the renal cortex of the kidney. And you guys know the specific name of the capillary beds that we find up here in the renal cortex? This is where the filtrate is going to be made out of these capillaries. These are called glomeruli. Okay, glomeruli are the specific names. And we'll look at a better, more detailed model of this. But essentially what happens is that off of these glomeruli, let me find a good one to use here. Off of these glomeruli are individual nephrons. So we're going to have the filtrate that's formed here at the glomeruli. Then it's going to go through this tubular network called the nephron. And this is where the kidney is going to do its thing. Okay, it's going to decide what goes back to the blood and what becomes part of the urine. And again, about 99% of the filtrate that's formed is going to return back to the blood. And 1% is going to leave the body as urine. So the filtrate goes through that tubes. Some of it is going to leave the body as urine. And to do that, it deposits that, well, I guess we can call urine at this point, into these tubes, which are going to run down the medullary pyramids. And what do we call these tubes running down the medullary pyramids? Those are the collecting ducts. And we can manipulate, we can absorb some water at this point, but there's not a whole lot besides that we can do once urine's in the collecting ducts. And then what happens is that urine drips from these collecting ducts into this funnel system. And once urine enters this funnel system, there's nothing else we can do with it. We can't manipulate the chemistry at any point. So we can just review this funnel system real quick. Here we have these little cups that are collecting urine that are dripping from these, what we call the renal papilla here. And these little cups individually are called, the singular term is a minor calyx. So this is a minor calyx, that's a minor calyx, that one. And collectively they're called minor calyces, is the plural term. And these minor calyces merge into what we call a major calyx. And there's a major calyx there, maybe another one down there. And then those major calyces merge into this funnel-shaped structure that's going to exit the kidney. And what do we call this funnel-shaped structure exiting the kidney?
Renal pelvis.
That's the renal pelvis. And then eventually the diameter smooths out, it becomes uniform, and at this point the tube is called the ureter. Good. Here we have a detailed set of models, and we're going to look at these two over here. And pretty much what's happening over here is happening in the renal cortex. So here's the renal cortex, and these models show some of the details that are happening up there. This right here is the cortical radiate artery radiating up the cortex. Then you have what we call an afferent arteriole coming off of that. And then these little red beads are the individual glomeruli. Those are the individual capillaries. And what's going to happen is, if this is the capillary right there, you're going to have the first part of the nephron that forms a cap over that capillary. And that's what we're looking at right here. And this is where filtrate is formed. This is where solution leaves the blood and it forms filtrate. So here's the afferent arteriole coming into the capillary bed. This is all the capillary bed. And then you have a vessel leaving it called the efferent arteriole. Then you have this cap-like structure that's the first part of the nephron, and we call that the glomerular capsule. Okay. And there's actually, this is the lining of the capsule, but there's also a layer of the capsule that wraps over the capillaries. And together it forms what's called a filtration membrane. So blood's going to come through here, and some of this material is going to leave the blood, and it's going to be caught by this glomerular capsule and form a new fluid called filtrate. So my question to you is, what material is going to leave the blood and become part of the filtrate? What types of things are we going to find in the filtrate? What's the main thing we're going to find? What's the main thing that the filtrate is going to be made up of? That any fluid in the body is made up of? Water. Okay, so it's mostly going to be water. What are some other things we're going to find in that filtrate?
Sodium?
Good. Electrolytes, sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, all that type of stuff. Glucose is another thing that we're going to find in the filtrate. Now, do we find glucose in the urine?
No.
Not in a healthy individual. So that tells us that glucose is going to be reabsorbed, but it does make its way into the filtrate. What are some things that do not become part of the filtrate, that go through this capillary bed and stay within the blood system?
Red blood cells.
Red blood cells. Good. Proteins in general are going to stay in the blood. So my next question is, what is this membrane selective for? Why are certain things able to move through it and other things not able to go through it? What is this membrane selective for?
Well, I know there's very fine pores and pores.
Yeah, the small particles.
Yeah, it's selective for size.
Yeah.
So small particles are going to make their way through, but large particles are not going to make their way through. Good. So the glomerular capsule catches the filtrate, then it enters into this tubule network. And that's what this model is showing over here. And I think I'll show this one right here. So here's this structure here is this. So this is the glomerulus in the glomerular capsule. This is where filtrate is formed. And then it enters the first part of the nephron right here, this first tubular part. And what do we call this first tubular part of the nephron? That's the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal because it's closest to the glomerulus, convoluted because it has twists and turns in it, and it's a tubule. What happens at the proximal convoluted tubule?
Where reabsorption occurs.
This is where the vast majority of reabsorption occurs. All of the glucose, all of the amino acid. Just got excited. All of the glucose, all of the amino acids, all of the vitamins and minerals, for the most part, are reabsorbed at the proximal convoluted tubule, because this is stuff that the body needs, right? So we're not going to mess around with it. We're going to be like, all right, let's just pull it back into the blood right away. Then it goes down into this next long structure. Anybody know what we call that?
The descending and ascending.
Distal convoluted. Loop of Henle.
The loop of Henle.
Yeah.
There we go. And there's a descending and an ascending portion. And at this point, we're reabsorbing more sodium. We're reabsorbing more water. You know, you have some stuff like that going on. So we have proximal convoluted tubule into the loop of Henle. And then what's this last part of the nephron?
Distal.
That's the distal convoluted tubule. And by the time we get to the distal convoluted tubule, almost everything's been reabsorbed. But we do have some remaining water to work with, and we have some remaining sodium to work with. And whether or not this material is reabsorbed back into the blood just depends on the body's needs at the time. And it's going to be under the control. What organ system is going to come in and control whether or not water and sodium is reabsorbed at these later stages of the nephron?
Endocrine.
The endocrine system. Good. Good. So here we have the distal convoluted tubule, and the main thing that we can reabsorb at the distal convoluted tubule is sodium. This is our last chance to reabsorb sodium. And when is a situation where the body would want to reabsorb sodium back into the blood? We just talked about this.
Based on blood pressure?
When blood pressure is low. So when blood pressure is low, it stimulates that renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. Aldosterone, we said it acts back on the kidney, but specifically it's going to act back and act on the distal convoluted tubule and cause sodium reabsorption. Good. And then anything at that point that hasn't been reabsorbed, it goes into this structure, which is not part of the nephron itself, but it's this long tube, and you can see that it collects what we can now call urine from several different nephrons. But you have this tube that's going to collect this urine, and it's going to run down the medullary pyramids, and it gives it this striated appearance. And what did we say these tubes were called? Collecting ducts. Good. And pretty much the only thing that we can reabsorb at the level of the collecting ducts
Water and sodium.
is water. Is water. Okay. And that's also going to be under endocrine control. Anybody know the hormone that's going to be released that's going to act on the collecting duct and cause water to be reabsorbed back into the blood?
Antidiuretic.
Antidiuretic hormone. Good. And where's antidiuretic hormone released?
Pituitary.
The posterior pituitary. Anybody know a situation where antidiuretic hormone would be released and we'd want that water to be reabsorbed?
Dehydration.
Good. Dehydration. What happens with dehydration is that all of the ions in the body become concentrated, and that increases a variable called the osmolarity. If you're dehydrated, your osmolarity concentration, your osmolarity goes up. The concentration of solutes in the blood goes up. And why is that a problem? Why is that a problem if your blood has an osmolarity that's too high? So normal homeostasis is about 280 to 300 milliosmoles is the ion concentration we want in the blood, or the electrolyte concentration in the blood. But what happens if that gets too high, if it gets up around 400 or 500? Why is that a problem for the red blood cells if they're in an environment where the osmolarity is too high?
They don't function.
It has to do with osmosis. Well, if you have a red blood cell that's surrounded by a concentrated saline solution, then that's going to draw water out of the red blood cells, and it causes them to shrink and not function properly. Okay, so that's something that we need to balance. So anyways, just put this in here for a second. Up here in the hypothalamus, there are sensory receptors that we call osmoreceptors. And those are detecting the osmolarity of the blood. Like I said, 280 to 300 milliosmoles is the homeostatic range. If you're dehydrated, the solutes are going to be more concentrated in the blood and your osmolarity is going to go up, which is a problem because, among other things, it can draw water out of the red blood cells. So that's something we need to maintain homeostasis over. So high osmolarity is detected by the hypothalamus, and that causes the release of antidiuretic hormone from the posterior pituitary. Antidiuretic hormone goes into the blood. And it acts back on the kidney, and specifically it acts back on the collecting duct. And it causes water to move from the collecting duct, water that would normally be part of the urine. It takes that water and brings it back into the blood. And by bringing water back into the blood, it dilutes those solutes and brings osmolarity back to where it needs to be. Okay. What does a diuretic do? It makes you pee. So what is antidiuretic hormone going to do? It's going to make you pee less. All right. So if you're dehydrated and you have high levels of antidiuretic hormone release, what's your urine output going to be like? High or low?
What's the question?
If you're dehydrated and you have high levels of antidiuretic hormone that are being released, what's your urine output going to be like? High or low? It's going to be low. You're going to have a low volume of concentrated urine. Good. And the last thing that I want to mention about the kidney, it's involved in water balance. It's involved in electrolyte balance. You know, not only sodium, but also potassium and calcium reabsorption in the distal convoluted tubule as well. Maintains the balance of those electrolytes. But the other thing that the kidney does is it maintains pH balance of the blood. With regards to pH balance in the body, the first level are these chemical buffers in the blood that work immediately, the carbonic acid bicarbonate system, and those can buffer a little bit, but so we have that mechanism that kicks in first. The second mechanism that kicks in that regulates acid-base balance is the respiratory system. Right? We can exhale more CO2 or exhale less CO2, and that regulates our pH balance. And that works within minutes. So we have the buffer systems that work within seconds, the respiratory system, which kicks in within minutes. But by far the most potent regulator of acid-base balance in the body are the kidneys. And the kidneys take days to act, but they have a much stronger, much larger buffering capacity. And in large part, that has to do with the collecting duct's ability to secrete bicarbonate into the blood. HCO3 minus. And it's going to be difficult to kind of explain without the equation in front of us, but this all goes back to the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. Okay? And if the pH, for instance, if the pH of the blood is too low, it's acidic. Your blood is acidic. That's something that the kidney wants to fix. How's it going to do that? It's going to release bicarbonate, HCO3 minus, into the blood. What does bicarbonate do? It binds up free hydrogen ions and eventually converts that to water. And that's important because pH balance is basically a measure of the hydrogen ion concentration. Too many hydrogen ions, you're going to become acidic.
Yeah.
Too little hydrogen ions, you're going to become basic.